Green Bay is receiving a $1 million grant from the Medical College of Wisconsin to help create and sustain an Office of Violence Prevention. The grant is expected to fund the office during its first 3 years. Samantha Cavalli tells us what this new office means in Green Bay's fight against gun violence.
I think for us, this represents the next step in a very intentional strategy to address the gun violence issue in our community.
The city of Green Bay was awarded a $1 million grant Thursday towards the creation of an Office of Violence Prevention. Its importance? To implement a long-term solution that has the capability of reducing and preventing firearm violence. The office will be a part of the Department of Community and Economic Development and will focus on neighborhoods to address disruption caused by violent crime.
If it is implemented well, it can be a huge success, and it really is a best practice in violence reduction in communities.
During the pandemic, Chief Davis says Green Bay saw a dramatic escalation in gun violence and associated violent crimes. He says the office is designed to get out in front of an issue before it happens in the first place.
We know that about half or so, maybe a little more, of our gun violence, especially in public spaces, is related to these sort of networks of people and social groups and disputes between them that just escalates and that involves retaliation.
And it's the best practice for interrupting the cycle of violence, not just in Green Bay, but the state of Wisconsin.
Folks, violence is not a foregone conclusion. It's not inevitable. There's more that we can do, and this is another public health crisis that deserves our attention and our action.
The city is hopeful the office will be up and running by this summer at the former Community Policing Center on North Irwin Avenue. Samantha Cavalli, Action 2 News, Green Bay.